Hello and welcome to my talk, which is called Copyright and Third-Party Code Use. This is much shorter than my original title, which was The First Rule of Copyright is you do not remove the license. And the second rule of copyright is you do not remove the license. I should start with a note about who I am. First of all, I am not a lawyer, and I am definitely not your lawyer. I am a developer. So while I would like to talk to you about copyright, which is a legal issue, you should not interpret this as legal advice. This talk is intended for any developer who works with third-party code, but who has never had any instruction on how to handle licenses. The first thing that you should know about copyright, and the reason I'm giving this presentation, is that many free software licenses extend the right to distribute and modify software to you. However, when you distribute third-party code, you do not become the copyright holder. Only the original author, the copyright holder, can attach license terms to their work or change those terms. If you choose to distribute their work along with yours, you must also distribute their license terms, and anyone who receives your software can use the free software components under their original license terms. Why? That's always the question that comes next, right? The general principle of free software licensing is that copyright forbids you from giving other people my software. If I assign a license to my work that extends distribution rights to you under some conditions, then you have a choice to either abide by the conditions or to not distribute my software. If you distribute it and don't abide by the conditions, then you are infringing the author's copyright, which can carry serious legal repercussions. So let's look at one license. The Apache license, version 2, says that you may distribute copies if you give recipients a copy of the license, and you retain copyright, patent, trademark, and attribution notices in your source code repository. Notices have to be retained at all stages of the development cycle. While you're developing code, you need to keep notices intact in the source code files and repositories, and later, when you distribute software, you need to keep the licenses with the work they cover. Now you might ask, what about other licenses? And I would give you a two-part answer to that question. First, similar requirements exist in all of the free software licenses that I can name. Apache's license is chosen merely because it's very clear on the subject. Second, those requirements actually exist in US copyright law itself, regardless of the text of the license. So no matter what license is attached to a third-party work, you must retain any licensed notices, regardless of how you use that work. This is an excerpt of US copyright law, which states, "No person shall remove or alter copyright management information," which it later defines as the terms and conditions for the use of the work, among other things. Now let's look at some examples of what that looks like in practice. Many licenses allow you to use the author's work, in whole or in part, and you may decide that you only need a small part of the author's work. For example, if you take a single function out of a file that had an Apache license notice, and you want to put that function in an existing file, you'd also need to take any license notice from the original file along with it. In this example, there are two license notices. The first covers the original file content, and the latter notice covers the portions that were copied in. This can be unclear to developers who come along later, so while that's typically allowed, it's often better to simply keep third-party code in a file of its own with the license notices intact, so that anyone who maintains this later is clear on exactly what license applies to what content. Regardless of which of those things you do, if you've imported portions of a third-party work into your application, you must also import their license file. As we move later in the development cycle to the distribution phase, we still need to keep the licenses intact. Here, we're going to look at Java as an example. If you install OpenJDK and look at its top-level directory, you will see a directory called legal. That contains directories describing different Java packages, and each containing license information for Java and for all of the third-party code that is used in the Java distribution. Another example is GitLab. In their software installation at the top level, they include a directory named licenses, where you can find the licenses for hundreds of third-party components that are used in the GitLab application. I also want to point out that this requirement doesn't apply to only code. The same thing is true for other copyrighted works, such as fonts. If you were to import free software fonts into a repository of your own, you would need to retain the license for those fonts. You should also be aware that licenses might not be immediately visible. For example, if you're looking at code that someone shared on Stack Overflow, that code should be licensed to you under the Creative Commons Share-alike license, and there are two risks there. First, if the person who put that code on Stack Overflow isn't actually the author of that code, if they've copied it from somewhere, then the copyright holder might be able to hold you liable for its use. For that reason alone, I advise that you don't use code from Stack Overflow directly in your application. The other risk is that Creative Commons Share-alike forbids you from placing any additional restrictions on the use of that code, similar to the requirement in the GPL. If you use code from Stack Overflow in a proprietary application, that might not require you to make your code available to your users, but it might invalidate any restrictions in your end-user license agreement. Now, I don't want you to walk away from this talk thinking that this is a primer on license compliance, because it's not that. You can't merely keep your license notices intact and believe that that is sufficient for you to be in compliance with your licensing. You need to evaluate each license independently and make sure that you can comply with all of the terms if you're going to distribute that code along with yours. But what I do want you to take away is that if you've been using third-party code without keeping the license information intact, then you're not complying with license requirements, and you should review all of the third-party code that you use to determine how to fix that. And it might be hard to identify third-party code if you didn't keep the license notices intact. The other thing I want to encourage you to do is to talk to the developers of the third-party work that you use. I believe that most developers will work with you to prevent or correct any potential infringement. As a sort of postscript, I want to say that I know that some of you think that this is all common sense. I know that some of you think this presentation was unnecessary, and I did too until I found a large commercial application that made liberal use of a variety of free software components and did not include any of their licenses. When I brought this problem to their attention, they didn't seem to understand exactly what problem I was describing. I started to talk to some developers that I know, and I learned that none of them had ever had any training regarding license handling from any employer. Now, naturally, XKCD has something relevant to say on this topic, and that is, there is nothing that everyone knows. Everything needs to be learned, especially the nuances of invented systems like copyright. And I think a part of that is that copying is so fundamental to our use of the internet and our use of computers more generally, that it becomes difficult to conceive of the fact that copying is actually a legally limited activity. So I've come around to the belief that everyone needs a few minutes of talk about copyright and license requirements. And if you understood all of these points already, maybe one of your coworkers doesn't, and you can give them that talk. Finally, XKCD comics are available under a Creative Commons non-commercial license, and this talk and its slides are available under Creative Commons Share-alike if you would like to use them. Thank you.